They thought victory was just a trigger pull away. On March 22, 2025, somewhere east of the Red Sea, the sky was crystal clear. No clouds, no interference. A U.S. Air Force F-22 Raptor glided like a ghost at cruising altitude. Everything was textbook, steady speed, signal readings aligned with a routine patrol. But then, ping. A red dot lit up on the screen, radar lock. Then another, and next came the unmistakable sound, a missile launch warning.
Warning.
The pilot didn't need to think. His left hand tightened on the throttle, his right yanked the stick. G-forces crushed his chest, but he'd survived worse. The F-22 veered hard right, screaming through the thin air. Behind him, countermeasure flares burst like white fireworks, a classic trick, never obsolete. A streak of fire ripped through the sky. An infrared-guided missile, launched from a zone controlled by a Houthis, fast, silent, and deadly enough to obliterate anything it touched. But it didn't touch. Because they hadn't fired at a random fighter. They'd fired at the aircraft designed to draw fire, a perfect decoy in a grand chess match. And the moment that missile missed as the Raptor disappeared behind a brutal arc, a chain of events had already been triggered. No more warnings, no more negotiations. From that instant on, the retaliation was pre-programmed, and nothing could stop it. The Raptor vanished from their line of fire, but it was never flying alone. At nearly 60,000 feet, silent and invisible to the naked eye, a MQ-4C Triton Navy drone circled in wide, sweeping ISR loops, its radar rotating like a living satellite. Every burst of ground heat, every spike in electromagnetic activity, it recorded it all. It carried no weapons, but it didn't need any. Its job was simpler and far colder. See everything, expose everything. What the Houthis failed to realize was that they had become the target long before that missile ever left its rail. Just a week earlier, after shooting down a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone, they'd celebrated on encrypted channels, sharing shaky footage of wreckage falling into the sea like a trophy. They thought they'd crossed a line without consequence. But that moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A test. Since then, every radar they powered up, every signal they pushed into the air had been monitored, logged, cross-referenced. And the F-22 flying into their range today, it wasn't there to retaliate. It was there to provoke, to bait. Its stealth skin absorbed radar. Its emissions mimicked a less sophisticated patrol craft. It was meant to get their attention. That missile launch? It wasn't a surprise. It was expected. And when it missed, when the flare lit the sky and the Raptor dove into the shadows, it gave the U.S. military exactly what it had waited for. Coordinates, signatures, movement, exposure. Every flash, every ping became part of a kill chain that had already begun ticking down. The instant their radar lit up, their fate was sealed. The verdict had already been written, in silence. There was no command conference, no high-level meeting, no red phone ringing in the situation room, because the response protocol had already changed. Weeks earlier, buried beneath layers of classified orders, the Pentagon had quietly authorized a shift in engagement rules. If an American aircraft is targeted, the retaliation is automatic. No need for congressional approval. No diplomatic notes, just data. Locked, confirmed, executed. So when the F-22's radar warning receiver screamed to life and that missile streaked past in vain, the act was already being translated into strike coordinates by a combat team aboard the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. Heat signatures, missile vectors, launch duration, fed in real time to the ship's fire control systems and relayed to multiple strike assets across the theater. The Houthis' mistake wasn't just firing the missile, it was staying in place long enough for the U.S. to see it. 5 minutes. That's all it took. In the belly of a nearby Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the VLS, Vertical Launch System, cells hissed open like a predator waking up. Tomahawk cruise missiles, already hot, locked onto 4 confirmed targets. The mobile launcher site, a radar vehicle 400 meters away, a suspected command hub buried into a hillside, and a nearby ammo depot emitting residual thermal spikes. Above them, on the deck of the USS Truman, The flight crew was already in motion. Green shirts fueled jets. Red shirts loaded munitions. Yellow shirts waved pilots into position. Steam hissed from the catapults. An E-2D Hawkeye launched first, followed by EA-18G Growlers, airborne blackout machines. The Retaliation wasn't a reply. It was a choreographed punishment, unfolding with terrifying precision. And down below, the Houthis unit still hadn't realized what they'd set in motion. But they would, soon enough. At exactly 0212 local time, the first Tomahawk struck. It came in low, hugging the contours of the desert like a shadow born from the sea. There was no siren, no alert, just a flash, and then a roar that flattened the launcher site and sent shockwaves racing across the terrain. Secondary explosions lit up the sand, revealing what lay beneath. Ammunition, propellants, maybe even a second-stage firing platform. Gone in seconds. But the real terror was how little time there was between the first hit and the second. The radar vehicle pinged one last time, an automated sweep, a desperate blink in the dark, and that was enough. An AGM-88 HARM missile launched minutes earlier by one of the Super Hornets now circling overhead, homed in like a bloodhound. Impact, detonation, silence. A mile to the west, the suspected command post, dug into a hill and draped in camo netting, wasn't spared either. A GBU-38 JDAM came down like judgment from the clouds, piercing the bunker's roof before shattering everything inside. The collapse was almost surgical. No flames, just dust, concrete, and the abrupt end of whatever operation had been run from within. The fourth strike was the loudest. The ammo depot, flagged by the Triton drone's thermal scan, was supposed to be hidden. It wasn't. The moment the bombs touched down, the desert horizon bloomed orange and red, igniting a chain of blasts that could be seen from 20 miles out. What they hadn't fired yet would never fire again. And through it all, the Growlers screamed overhead, jamming signals, scrambling comms, flooding enemy frequencies with static. Those on the ground couldn't call for help, couldn't coordinate, couldn't even ask what was happening, because by the time they realized, the war was already over. By the time the last explosion echoed into stillness, the night over the desert was no longer dark. It glowed faintly with embers and disbelief. The radar was gone. The launchers obliterated, the command post crushed beneath its own ceiling, and every voice that once coordinated the operation had been silenced, not through censorship, but through total electromagnetic erasure. The Growlers didn't just jam frequencies, they erased communication as a concept. What remained was smoke, static, and men stumbling through sand with no orders left to follow. But the most devastating impact wasn't physical. It was psychological. For years, the Houthis' sponsors, shadowy networks with regional ambitions and foreign tech, had operated under a single assumption: that escalation would be met with hesitation, that the West, distracted and cautious, would not risk overreaction. But this night rewrote that doctrine. The missile didn't land, but it launched. And in modern warfare, that's all that matters. The Houthis lost more than weapons. They lost momentum, confidence, timing. They learned in under 15 minutes that a failed strike on an American fighter isn't a miscalculation, it's a trigger. And from the cockpit of the original F-22, now circling quietly above the Red Sea in a holding pattern, the pilot listened to the strike confirmations like lines in a post-mortem. No cheers, no bravado. Just calm, deliberate reports. Target Alpha neutralized. Target Bravo destroyed. All assets returning to base. He hadn't even fired a shot, and yet the battlefield had been redrawn. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about setting precedent, the kind that echoes in command centers and war rooms across continents. The kind that doesn't fade by morning. Because now anyone who lights up a U.S. aircraft on radar won't wonder if the Americans will respond. They'll wonder how long they have left once they do. When the final dust settled, there were no more missiles, no more radar signals, no more commanding voices. The remaining operatives of the Houthis stood in the shredded remains of what used to be a forward position. They didn't move. They didn't shout. They didn't run. Because they didn't know where to run to. Every command post had been leveled, every comms channel either dead or spitting static into the void. And overhead, not a single aircraft dropped down. No surrender order, no second warning, just a silence so cold it felt metallic. And that's when they began to realize this wasn't a battle. Because they'd never been given a chance to fight. They didn't lose in combat. They were erased before they could even reload. This wasn't a lack of preparation. This was a lack of relevance. They had no counterstrike, no fallback. Their radar was gone. Their launchers vaporized. Their coordination fractured beyond repair. All that remained was a single question whispered among them. What just happened? Miles away in a buried operations bunker, analysts stared at blank screens. No final reports, no casualty updates, just grayed out indicators and signal loss, as if an entire unit had been wiped off the map by a single, invisible hand. And as whispers began to leak of an immediate U.S. retaliation, the reality settled in. This wasn't a warning shot. This was how a modern system neutralizes a threat before it even becomes a war. No press release was issued. No cameras flashed. No podium statement declared the outcome. And yet, across oceans, the message landed louder than any official broadcast ever could. Within hours, intelligence satellites picked up the aftermath, scorched terrain, absent emissions, sudden shifts in electronic activity. In war rooms from Beijing to Moscow, analysts began piecing together telemetry data. Signal intercepts confirmed a clean, multi-domain U.S. retaliation executed within minutes of the provocation. No delays, no public warnings, just precision and finality. And while the Houthis struggled to regroup, confused, disoriented, and suddenly without their high ground assets, those watching took notes. For Iran, the lesson was clear. The days of using proxies as expendable chess pieces might be over. For China, the reality sank in colder. The U.S. wasn't just capable of rapid response, it could preload a kill chain and let the enemy trip it themselves. And for Russia, who had watched the skies of Ukraine with jamming equipment and outdated missile arrays, the precision of this strike painted a new kind of battlefield, one where speed, silence, and synchronized domains beat brute force. But the truest shift happened in perception, because the U.S. didn't just respond, it rewrote the terms of engagement without announcing it. No threats, no leaks, just execution. From this point on, every hostile radar operator will pause, hand hovering over a switch, and silently wonder, is this the one that gets me vaporized? And that pause, brief as it may be, is the new deterrent. A hesitation forged not by treaties or summits, but by the sight of 4 tomahawks carving clean arcs through a moonlit sky, followed by silence so complete it felt engineered. The battlefield didn't just shift on the ground that night, it tilted, and the world felt it. In a different war, at a different time, there might have been negotiations, warnings, diplomacy, but this wasn't that kind of war. This was algorithmic, pre-mapped, and surgical. It wasn't about sending a message, it was the message. The F-22 didn't retaliate, it simply endured. The drone didn't pull a trigger, it watched the trigger being pulled and handed the coordinates to steel and fire. And in under 18 minutes, the entirety of a coordinated enemy operation ceased to exist. No victory parade, no headlines screaming vengeance, just silence. One that stretched from the Red Sea to encrypted war rooms thousands of miles away, where generals sat still and adversaries reran simulations with a new variable. What if the next strike is already loaded, and the only thing I control is whether it gets released? This was not about dominance, it was about precision deterrence. The U.S. didn't escalate, it eliminated escalation as a tactic. It built a system that reacts faster than bureaucracy, strikes cleaner than retaliation, and vanishes before the enemy realizes they've been punished. And perhaps the most chilling truth, it didn't take a battle group, or a war declaration, or weeks of mobilization. It took one radar lock, one mistake, one assumption that the jet flying overhead was just another patrol, when in fact it was a doorway. a doorway to a war they didn't expect. So now the world watches the skies differently, not for what might come, but for what won't. Because if no one speaks, if no threats are exchanged, and if the only sound is the echo of precision, then you're no longer in a standoff. You're already in the aftermath. And all that's left to decide is who knew it first.